All right, folks. Good evening. So, we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about a challenging topic. And the question for this evening's apologetics is, how can a loving God send people to hell? The subject of hell is a very challenging doctrine in the Bible, but it has full scriptural support. If anything, Jesus probably speaks of it more than anyone else in the Bible. Many believers and non-believers struggle to reconcile this truth with a loving God. And so we're going to spend some time examining some of the common objections to hell and looking how we might respond to those. But before we do that, we're going to talk about source materials and places to dig deeper. So what I'm doing is going to be a fairly high-level overview, but a lot of really good material can be found in these three places. So The Reason for God, which is actually this book here by Timothy Keller, is where I drew a lot of the material for this evening's talk from, and along with C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. But another good resource as well is the Reasonable Faith website, run by the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig. So all three of those are very good places if you want to dig a bit deeper into this. So let's start with a little bit of context. So the English word hell, there isn't really a single word for hell in the New Testament, and the Old English word comes from the Old English, hell, or the Hela, the name of the Norse goddess of the underworld of the same name. So in the Bible, we actually have, particularly in the New Testament, three different words that are used for hell. We have Sheol or Hades, Infernus. We have Gehinnom, and then Tartarus. So Hades has very similar terms to basically Sheol, like a place of shades, and it's basically talked about both the good and the bad going there. But in the Old Testament, the concept of death and the underworld is very vague and ambiguous. Gehenna refers to the valley of Hinnom, which was a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem, which was normally on fire all the time. And so the bodies of those deemed to have died in sin without hope of salvation, such as people who committed suicide, were thrown there to be destroyed. Gehenna is used in the New Testament as a metaphor for the final place of punishment for the wicked after resurrection a lot of the time. And then Tartaru, or throw to Tartarus, which, so the original Greek is taken from the Iliad, and then this appears in the New Testament in 2 Peter 2:4, where it's parallel to the use of the noun form in the apocryphal text 1 Enoch. And so this is referred to as a place of incarceration of the fallen angels. It mentions nothing about human souls being sent there in the afterlife. So just something to think about while we talk about the concept of hell, and that it's a little bit more complicated than just one word. So what is hell? Well, Jesus speaks of hell under three symbols. Punishment, so the idea of everlasting punishment, as spoken of in Matthew 25:46. Destruction, so fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell, Matthew 10:28. Privation, exclusion, or banishment into the darkness outside, or isolation, say. So here we can think about, say, the parables of the man without a wedding garment, or of the wise and foolish virgins, and basically how that ends for the people who make poor choices. The thing is, though, is that although a lot of imagery and metaphors may be used about hell, that doesn't mean that hell isn't a real place. Hell is very much biblically affirmed as a real place, not a metaphor. So let's start with looking at some of the objections. So one of the first objections that we have is just the idea that a God of judgment simply can't exist. And this seems to be a prevalent idea, particularly in the West. So, in the book Habits of the Heart, the American sociologist Robert Bellah, so this book was published in 1985, explored the role of religion in American society. And he argued that Americans are torn between individualism and the desire for community, and that these tensions are just reflected in their religious beliefs. Interestingly, one of the key findings from this text is that 80% of Americans would agree with the statement: an individual should arrive at his or her own beliefs independent of any church or synagogue. It concludes that the most fundamental belief in American culture is that moral truth is relative to the individual consciousness. Our culture has no problem with a God who lives or supports us no matter how we choose to live. But it does seem to object very strongly to the idea of a God who punishes people for their sincerely held beliefs, even if they are mistaken. But where does this objection come from? Well, in The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis looks at the differences between ancient and modern views of reality. He attacks the smug belief that magic was part of the ancient world, and now we have science. The truth is that there was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The heyday was the 16th and 17th centuries, the same period as the rise of science. So the thing is that magic and science sort of rose about in the same period of time. And so C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, the serious magical endeavour and the serious scientific endeavour are twins. One was sickly and died, and the other was strong and throve. But they are twins, they were both born of the same impulse. In other words, although they started around the same time, we still have science, but we don't have magic anymore. Lewis describes this new approach to spiritual and physical reality. There is something which unites magic and applied science while separating them both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail then. So the ancients had this idea of a transcendent moral order with consequences. You know, the path to wisdom would lie in conforming to this order by developing characters such as humility, courage, compassion, discretion, and loyalty. The modern Western view was based on natural order rather than a supernatural order. In other words, and the fact that reality is malleable, and consequently the idea that we can fit reality to our desires rather than fit ourselves to reality. As a way to look at this, the ancients looked at an anxious person and prescribed spiritual character change. Modernity talks instead about stress management techniques. Now, that's not to say that science is a bad thing. Obviously, I certainly wouldn't say that as a practicing scientist. And Lewis himself knew that readers might think he was against the scientific method as such, but he protested that he was not. He wanted us to realise, however, that modernity was born in dreams of power. The Christian worldview, it's also important to note, the Christian worldview is actually the foundation for science. The idea of the uniformity of the world, the uniformity of nature, because of an ordered God is what makes science possible, and was the foundation worldview for Western science. Writing during World War II, Lewis was standing in the midst of some of the bitterest of the modern spirit's fruit. Lewis's friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, wrote The Lord of the Rings about the consequences of seeking power and control rather than wisdom, and the glad enjoyment of the givenness of God's creation. So the point is here is that with the modern view, we seek control over the physical, and we believe that this then spills over into the metaphysical realm, and that we have the right to make judgments and pronouncements there. This leads us to think that we can determine what is right and what is wrong, and then we feel aggrieved when we find that there's a God who judges us. The idea of Judgment Day seems impossible to us in the modern Western view. In other words, history has basically been a quest for control, and this has led to dire consequences. The world wars, the Crusades, many other things. The truth is that God is a transcultural God. In the Western view, people are often offended by the idea of a judging God. In other traditional cultures, people are offended by the idea of a forgiving God. So who is right? Both and neither. And that is because God is both a God of love and a God of judgment. And God is a transcultural truth that will offend and contradict all human cultures, which are ever-changing and imperfect. So let's move on to looking at another objection. A God of judgment can't be a God of love. Shouldn't he forgive and accept everyone? The thing is, though, is that loving people can be filled with anger because of their love, not in spite of it. If you see those you love ruined, even by they themselves, you can get angry. We see this explained in a quote from Hope Has Its Reasons by Becky Pippert. Think how we feel when we see someone we love ravaged by unwise actions or relationships. Do we respond with benign tolerance as we might towards strangers? Far from it. Anger isn't the opposite of love. Hate is, and the final form of hate is indifference. God's wrath is not a cranky explosion, but his settled opposition to the cancer, which is eating out the insides of the human race he loves with his whole being. We see this idea basically in the Bible itself. The Bible says that God's wrath flows from his love and delight in his creation. He is angry at evil and injustice, destroying his creation's peace and integrity. We see an example of this in Psalm 147. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and loving towards all he has made. And then a little later, the Lord watches over all those who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. It's important to be clear, however, that God desires for all to be saved and find eternal life. He takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, as also shown in the Bible. In 1 Timothy 2 verse 4, we see, who wants all people to be saved, God, and come to a knowledge of the truth. Or in Ezekiel 33:11, say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel? This idea of judgment and a God of love not being able to be, or rather a God of judgment not being also a God of love, also feeds into the idea that people who believe in a God of judgment will not want to reconcile. In other words, if you believe in a God that smites evildoers, you might think that it's okay to do your own smiting. Examples of this in history are things like the Crusades, where people take righteousness into their own hands, thinking that, or claiming at least, that they're doing God's work. But let's look at this a little bit more. So, Miroslav Volf, in a book called Exclusion and Embrace, a theological exploration of identity, has the following to say. If God were not angry at injustice and deception and did not make a final end to violence, that God would not be worthy of worship. The only means of prohibiting all recourse to violence by ourselves is to insist that violence is legitimate only when it comes from God. My thesis that the practice of non-violence requires a belief in divine vengeance will be unpopular with many in the West, but it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis that human non-violence results from the belief in God's refusal to judge. In a sun-scorched land soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die with other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. This is the Yale theologian here, Miroslav Volf, a Croatian who had seen violence in the Balkans, does not see the doctrine of God's judgment in the way that we were talking about before. So, what does he say? He reasons actually that a lack of belief in a God of vengeance secretly nourishes violence and makes people more likely to act violently. The human impulse to make perpetrators of a crime pay is almost overwhelming. This cannot become with platitudes. Violence won't solve anything, rings hollow if your family has just been murdered. And this desire for violence can sometimes bleed over into a desire for vengeance and lead into an endless cycle of vengeance. So how do we avoid the desire for vengeance? How do we avoid ending up in that cycle, endless cycle of vengeance? Belief in a God of justice who will put all things right. Again, we see biblical support for this view. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. This is in Romans 12:19, where it's also quoting Deuteronomy 32:35. In the discreet charms of nihilism, Czesław Miłosz remembers Karl Marx's comments on religion. So you might have heard of this, because this is one of Marx's most famous comments, the idea that religion is the opiate of the people. In other words, the idea of the afterlife would lead the poor and the working classes to put up with unjust social conditions. But Milosz responds, and now we are witnessing a transformation. A true opium of the people is the belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders are not going to be judged, but all religions recognize that our deeds are imperishable. Another complaint is that belief in a God of judgment will lead to a more brutal society. Milosz had personally seen in both Nazism and communism that the loss of belief in a God of judgment can lead to brutality, and both of those ideologies led to millions of deaths. If free to shape life and morals any way we choose, without ultimate accountability, it can lead to violence. Wolf and Milosz argue that the doctrine of God's final judgment is the necessary undergirding for human practices of love and peacemaking. In other words, we can only choose to put down our arms and not act violently if we believe that God will put things right in the end. Okay, so let's move on to another objection. A loving God would not allow hell. I cannot reconcile even the idea of hell with a loving God. You might say, fighting evil and injustice in the world is one thing, but sending people to hell is another. The Bible speaks of eternal punishment. How does that fit with a God of love? I cannot reconcile even the idea of hell with a loving God. How do we address this understandable recoiling? Let's examine how a lot of people think hell actually works. So, God gives us time. God judges. If we have not made the right choices, we go to hell. He sticks his fingers in his ears, ignores our pleas for mercy on the way down, and says, too late, you've had your chance. A lot of people cannot even stand the idea of hell, and the part of it is this misunderstanding of how hell works. For a lot of people, they think it works like this, but this is a caricature of hell and misrepresents evil and God. So let's try looking at this in a different fashion. The biblical picture is that sin separates us from the presence of God, which is the source of all joy, indeed of all love, wisdom, or good things of any sort. Since we were originally created for God's immediate presence, only before his face will we thrive, flourish, and achieve our highest potential. If we were to lose his presence totally, that would be hell, the loss of our capability for giving or receiving love or joy. In other words, pride leads us to sin, sin separates us from God, and God honors our choice to be separate from him, and the gulf widens, we lose his presence and send ourselves to hell. We can also look at this from the angle of personal disintegration, as well as this idea of trajectory. The common image of hell in the Bible is fire. What does fire do? Fire disintegrates. Even in this life, we can see the kind of soul disintegration that self-centeredness creates. Bitterness, envy, anxiety, paranoid thoughts, and the mental denials and distortions that accompany them. What if when we die, we don't end, but spiritually our life extends into eternity? Hell is the trajectory of a soul living a self-absorbed, self-centered life, going on forever and ever. We see support for this view in the story in Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke. Lazarus is a poor man who begs at the gate of a cruel rich man. They both die, and Lazarus goes to heaven while the rich man goes to hell. There he looks up and sees Lazarus in heaven in Abraham's bosom. We pick up the story there. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things, but now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." And you can see that Jesus was obviously referring to himself as well. In the story, we see a reversal of status, and we see that the rich man has become completely blind to what has happened. He expects Lazarus to be his servant and bring him water, even despite what has happened. He doesn't ask to leave hell, but implies he did not have enough information. We see blame shifting, denial, spiritual blindness. The wealthy man has no name in the story because all of his sense of identity was in wealth, and once he lost that wealth, he lost his sense of self in hell. So hell writ small. So we've examined the idea that hell is one's freely chosen identity apart from God on an infinite trajectory. We see this same process writ small in addiction to drugs, alcohol, pornography, and the like. We see personal disintegration, the need for more fair and equal kick as time goes on with less satisfaction. Isolation, blame shifting to justify our behavior. No one understands, everyone is against me. Greater self-absorption and self-pity. Enslaving addiction is basically when we build our lives on anything, even good things, except God. And if we do that, these things can lead to that personal disintegration, increasing isolation, denial, delusion, and self-absorption. This can lead to the loss of humility, at which point we end up losing touch with reality. And the idea of this picture writ small in addiction is writ large in hell. In eternity, this goes on forever. No one ever asks to leave hell. Heaven seems a sham. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. He describes a busload of people from hell in The Great Divorce who come to the outskirts of heaven. They are urged to leave behind the sins that have trapped them in hell, but they refuse. Lewis's descriptions of these people are striking because we recognize in them the self-delusion and self-absorption that are writ small in our own addictions. Hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others, but you are still distinct from it. You may even criticize it in yourself and wish you could stop it, but there may come a day when you can no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood or even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. It is not a question of God sending us to hell. In each of us there is something growing which will be hell unless it is nipped in the bud. In the book, the people in hell are miserable. Why? They're imprisoned in self-centeredness, unchecked pride, paranoia, self-pity, certainty that everyone else is wrong and that everyone else is an idiot. Hell writ large. All humility is gone, and the so is sanity. Pride grows as personal disintegration expands with continual blame shifting. No one is sent to cell saying, "I'm sorry, let me out." The people there would rather have freedom apart from God because they're worried that God is taking away power and freedom. C.S. Lewis says that hell is the greatest monument to human freedom. God gives people what they want, including freedom from himself. In Romans 1:24, we see that. God gave them up to their desires. What could be fairer than that? In The Problem of Pain and The Great Divorce as well, C.S. Lewis sort of sums it up along these lines. There are only two kinds of people: those who say, "Thy will be done" to God, or those to whom God, in the end, says, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, it wouldn't be hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. So let's look at this idea of eternal punishment. The common objection here is that eternal punishment for transitory sin seems unfair. In other words, there's only so much sin you can conduct in one lifetime, but yet we're condemned to suffer eternally for it. But the thing is that we need to change our perspective. Based on what we've been talking about, you can see this idea of sin as a trajectory into eternity, rather than as the sum of sinning in a lifetime. More life may just mean more sin. It doesn't necessarily imply a change in direction. If a million chances would change the person, it's very easy to believe that God would grant them. But at the end of the day, finality must come, and it doesn't take a great deal of faith, knowing that God is omniscient, to know that he knows when the chop must come. So something else you'll often hear people say is, I believe in a God of love, but what does that actually mean? It seems to be a common idea that God should love all and judge no one. But this confuses kindness with love. God is not a big grandpa in the sky, or a big senile grandpa in the sky. We do not find evidence for this. So where do we find evidence for this idea of a God of love? Do we find it in history? I think bloody wars, human violence, greed, sin, etc. would all speak against that. Do we find evidence for a God of love in the natural order? Nature is red in tooth and claw. Not really. Well, what about religion then? Well, not in paganism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Islam, or Judaism. Ancient pagan religions emphasize the idea of a God of judgment. Religions like Islam may say God is kind and merciful, but the idea of a personal relationship with God, with a loving God that is intimate like a spouse, or who pours effusions of love into us through the Holy Spirit, is disrespectful for them. The fact is that the only place we see the idea of a God of love is in the Bible. And in the Bible, God is not only a God of love, he's a God of judgment as well. And so this common idea that God should love all and judge no one requires a whole lot of faith with no evidence. So, based on everything we've thought, let's try and put it all together into a thought experiment. Can we imagine a situation where God's judgment makes sense? So this comes out of C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain. And so here he presents a thought experiment. Imagine someone who has risen to power by treachery and cruelty, who exploits noble emotions of their victims and purely for the selfish gain all their life, while laughing at their stupidity. They use their success for self-gratification of lust and hatred, and finally die, even betraying their own accomplices. No feelings of guilt or remorse. They think they've cracked the riddle of life, laughing at God and humanity. The question is, we need to avoid the temptation to seek revenge against such a person. We must seek every means of conversion for such a person. But what if they won't be changed? C.S. Lewis responds, can you really desire that such a man, remaining what he is, and he must be able to do that if he has free will, should be confirmed forever in his present happiness, should continue for all eternity to be perfectly convinced that the laugh is on his side? Or is there an ethical demand for justice? He continues, and if you cannot regard this as tolerable, is it only your wickedness, only spite that prevents you from doing so? Or do you find that conflict between justice and mercy, which has sometimes seemed to you such an outmoded piece of theology, now actually at work in your own mind, and feeling very much as if it came to you from above, not from below? You are moved not by a desire for the wretched creature's pain as such, but by a truly ethical demand that sooner or later the right should be asserted, the flag planted in this horribly rebellious soul, even if no fuller and better conquest is to follow. In a sense, it is better for the creature itself, even if it never becomes good, that It should know itself a failure, a mistake. Even mercy can hardly wish to such a man his eternal, contented continuance in such ghastly illusion. Thomas Aquinas said of suffering, as Aristotle has said of shame, that it was a thing not good in itself, but a thing which might have a certain goodness in particular circumstances. That is to say, if evil is present, pain at recognition of the evil, being a kind of knowledge, is relatively good, for the alternative is that soul should be ignorant of the evil, or ignorant of the evil that is contrary to its nature. Either of which, says the philosopher, is manifestly bad, and I think, though we tremble, we agree. The demand that God should forgive such a man while he remains what he is based on confusion between condoning and forgiving. To condone an evil is simply to ignore it, to treat it as if it were good, but forgiveness needs to be accepted as well as offered if it is to be complete. And a man who admits no guilt can accept no forgiveness. All of this then can be summed up with this final quote from C.S. Lewis in The Problem of Pain. In the long run, the answer to all those who object to the doctrine of hell is itself a question. What are you asking God to do? To wipe out their past sins at all costs? To give them a fresh start, smoothing every difficulty and offering every miraculous help? But he has done so on Calvary. To forgive them? They will not be forgiven. To leave them alone? Alas, I am afraid that is what he does. So, just again, reminder of those source materials if you want to dig deeper into any of these, particularly The Reason for God, in C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain, and then of course also William Lane Craig's website. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and we can have some questions and discussion.
So are there other stories in the Bible where, I guess it talks about a person in hell who doesn't want to leave hell, like you suggested? Or is it really just, I guess it's probably just the rich man and Lazarus?
I mean, that's the most obvious one that I can think of. I don't think there's many others. I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts on that, but, nothing else comes to mind.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any either. I think too, part of what I think you've kind of captured is that so many times we think of hell simply as a consequence of what we do and not as a consequence of who we are. We have, the statement, we're not sinners because we sin because we are sinners. And I think that also applies here. So I think you've captured that without really saying in those words, that it's far more fundamental than just, you drove 56 in a 55 mile an hour zone or something like that, or you forgot you didn't stop at a stop sign or a red light, where, sometimes somebody does something and like, oh, this wasn't who I am, it is not consistent with my character, but it's really an understanding that no, our sin is not just our actions, it is a heart that is oriented away from God and into self.
Yeah.
And that, in a certain sense, hell is not, in a certain sense, it's a continuation and a magnification of that which already exists as far as the state of the person's soul.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very nice, succinct summary. Anybody else? Well, I'm glad I've stunned you all into silence.
I like the images and stuff.
Did you make the slides yourself?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
I think also, this is purely a tactical question or thought, is that when engaging with this, you drop ideas of people's, thoughts of hell and judgment, that one of the questions is worth asking is how did you come to conclude that this is true. That many times people's beliefs about God and about hell are grounded in nothing more than their personal preferences, rather than any kind of evidence that things ought to be a certain way. Because the reality is, if God is the transcendent creator of everything, that means there is no one who can hold him to account. He is the standard of right and wrong. Because if we try to judge an action of God's as being right or wrong, then we're holding him up to a standard. But that standard would then have to be somebody above him, who would then have to be God.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you get this infinite regress, because then we judge the actions of that God, and then we find that wanting. It's like, okay, there must be another standard. So we also have to understand that, we can't just make up stuff about any aspect of reality and just assume it's true. Otherwise, I would live at the dairy downstairs and just eat them out of sight every day and every night and never gain an ounce, if that's how it really worked. But I have to, as you point out, I appreciate pointing out, because I had not thought about the connection between, the pre-modern and modern man of the idea of we are subject to reality as it is versus we think we have the power to reshape reality the way we want. Which, we obviously have some. This building in itself, it was not, it exists because we reshaped a small corner of the universe to our liking, but that there's limits.
The problem is the overreach, and so we believe that not only does our power to that reality is malleable, we believe that the metaphysical is malleable as well.
Exactly.
And that's the problem, because that's where you get the overreach.
Right, because the fact that I can swim 100 meters does not automatically follow that I can swim to Hawaii.
That would be something.
Yes, it would.
I definitely like the discussion on where, sort of these more individualistic notions of God and religion came from, and living in this sort of pluralistic society where religion just sort of boils down to, that's something that you do for whatever reason, rather than the transcendent order in which God has ordained his universe and God works and stuff like that, that deals with actual truths that, even if you don't believe it, you're still subjected to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I found that was one of the things I found very helpful as well when I was preparing this. Was that it was really useful for context and just sort of seeing where these ideas had come from.
I also like the point that not believing in hell and judgment and vengeance, that there is an avenger that's not us, but that the wicked will have their time to come. It only gets and brings about more wickedness. And the scholar that you mentioned, and there are some others that I've heard cited who go through genocides and stuff like that, who have this, because of the experience they go to, have a renewed appreciation for these doctrines, for judgment and for hell. And it's we see this in scripture itself. I think Habakkuk or Lamentations or wherever, just looking at the wickedness of Jerusalem and of Israel, and seeing all this destruction, all this wickedness, where are you, God? And God answering, the wicked will have their time. That's something that God uses to control the wickedness of man by his common grace.
Yes, very much so.
And Psalm 73 is a single psalm that captures the entire gamut of emotion there too.
Yeah.
But one thing, if you're saying that if you're judging God and the person who's judging him is higher than him, you're going to run into a problem.
Yeah.
If you keep judging the one after the other, you're going to keep going on and on with figuring out new gods and
Yep, that's right.
Gradually run out of numbers.
Yep.
Regress. But shall the clay say to the potter that formed it, why did you make me like this? So Romans 9, mic drop.
All right. Well, if we haven't got any more questions, then we can call it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramin. This is really good. Thanks for